Welcome to Bite-Sized Battles. Richard looked down upon his father's lifeless face, etched as it was with the despair and sickness that had racked the old king in his final days. A pang of guilt surely flitted through Richard's heart. In league with the French king, he had rebelled against his father, Henry, 2 years earlier, before only recently forcing him into a humiliating peace. Shortly before he died, Henry had received word that his favourite and youngest son, John, had also turned against him. It had been the final blow. But here in the peace and chill of the church at Fontevraud Abbey, whatever emotions Richard felt, he betrayed none of them. Beneath the stone arches and cold carved columns, he simply stood a while, then turned on his heel and walked out. The sun was rising on a new era. The Angevin crown was now his, and he had a very clear idea of what to do with it. Earlier in 1187, mud-splattered messengers had raced into his rooms to see him. Panting and out of breath, he had servants give them water, urging them to calm while inwardly seething for the clearly urgent news they carried. Finally, one managed to gasp the words, "Jerusalem, fallen." The words struck Richard like a hammer blow. Jerusalem, where Christ had died and risen again. Jerusalem. Who? Richard demanded. The reply, Saladin. It was a name that would come to define the early years of Richard's reign and lead him to the Holy Land of the Levant. Now, 2 years later, as Richard strode away from his father's corpse, he marched into his own destiny. The Third Crusade had begun, and Richard, King of England, was coming. I'm Andrew Mackenzie, this is Bite-Sized Battles, and welcome to the 3rd episode of the Angevins, Crusade. A big thanks to thegradsock.com for making this series possible. Saladin was the Sultan of Egypt and Syria, and the seemingly unstoppable founder of the Ayyubid Dynasty. He had first cut his way to becoming Sultan by battering other Muslim rivals into submission or death. He then turned his sights on the Christian Crusader states created in the wake of the First Crusade, nearly a century earlier. Chief among them, the glittering jewel for both Christians and Muslims, was the Kingdom of Jerusalem. In 1187, following a near-total victory at the Battle of Hattin, swarms of Muslim soldiers descended on Jerusalem, and the resulting siege lasted barely a fortnight. When hearing the news, the messengers would have told Richard of Saladin's ruthless slaughter of Frankish soldiers at Hattin, a veritable abattoir of a battle at which overconfident Crusader armies had succumbed first to thirst, then to the Muslim bow and lance, and finally the survivors to the butchery of executioners' blades. He heard of the massacre of holy knights and the vengeful slaying of the Prince of Antioch, Renaud de Chatillon. Tales reached his ears of Christian terror as thousands were sold into slavery across Muslim Mesopotamia and North Africa. All of this reviled Richard, but his face went truly ashen when he heard of the capture at Hattin of the relic of the true cross, which had always been borne at the head of every Christian army in the Holy Land. Hattin, the true cross, Jerusalem. All of Europe was aghast. Jerusalem's loss alone sent shockwaves through Western Christendom. Even before the city's fall, the Pope Urban III is said to have simply died upon hearing the news of Hattin. His successor, Gregory VIII, immediately called for the Third Crusade, and when he died just 2 months later, the third pope in as many months, Clement, renewed the call. Again and again the cry echoed across the kingdoms of Europe. The strong arms and stout hearts of Christian warriors were needed now more than ever before. Jerusalem must be retaken. Richard was a martial man, perhaps the most martial of all the great lords of Europe. He had recently acquired the name Lionheart for his brilliant, fierce, and even sometimes reckless leadership during the wars against his father. He champed at the bit to leave immediately, wanting to be the first to lead horse and axe into the fray against the Muslim hordes. But this was 1187. He was still fighting for the inheritance he thought he was being cheated out of. He had to hear of his brother-in-law, William II of Sicily, leading the charge instead, rushing from his shores with 50 ships and hundreds of knights as soon as he heard of Jerusalem's fall. The Holy Roman Emperor too, Frederick Barbarossa, had rallied tens of thousands of troops and set them off on the long journey down the Danube. By June 1190, though, both William II and Barbarossa were dead, the latter drowned in what's now the Göksu River in southern Turkey, not far from his destination. Most of both armies simply turned around and went home. With this, the Third Crusade was on a knife edge, but Richard would not allow it to fail without his intervention. And just a month after Barbarossa's drowning, Richard's father Henry was dead too. It was time. With his accession to the English and Angevin thrones, Richard just needed to ensure his lands were safe while he was gone. And the principal threat was his erstwhile ally against his father, the French king, Philip II. Richard knew enough of Philip to realise his former alliance wasn't out of the kindness of Philip's heart. He was a Capetian, and the Capetian kings had always sought to destabilise the Angevins wherever and whenever they could. It just so happened that against Henry II, their desires aligned. But Richard could not count on Philip's good graces now that he was the leading Angevin, the King of England and the Duke and Count of half of France. Philip, for his part, had deep suspicions about any Angevin. Which swathe of France would they snap up next? But he had taken the cross too, so both Richard and Philip found themselves to be bedfellows again. They would go to the Holy Land together. Before they left, they swore not to attack each other's lands, had their barons swear the same, and promised to share the spoils of war equally. And so, with the treaties in place and kisses of peace still drying on each other's cheeks, the two kings prepared for the crusade they had been waiting years for. Richard immediately sent England and all his Angevin lands into a hive of activity. William Marshal, perhaps one of the greatest knights to have ever lived and really deserves his own story, had a 13th century biographer who wrote this about Richard's frenzied preparation for the crusade. King Richard prepared a great fleet of ships to take him to the Holy Land. There were many fine ships, fortified with towers and magnificently equipped and manned by such worthy crews that they had no fear about putting up a stout defence against any galleys or hostile forces. Richard shipped so much silver and gold, so many furs of minever and grey squirrel, so much plate, so many splendid and expensive garments and arms of every kind, that no man who had seen them could easily have listed them one by one. There were no stores wanting. There were flitches of bacon, wines, wheat, flour and ship's biscuit in abundance. There was pepper, cumin, wax and spices and electuaries of the very best available. There were many other drinks and jellies and syrup, bows, crossbows and bolts, sharp-pointed and swift-flying. Between the autumns of 1189 and 90, Richard spent £14,000, several million today, just ordering immense masses of food. And not only this, huge sums paid for the ships and vast quantities of weapons and war horses, and the countless chests of pay for thousands of soldiers and knights. His father Henry had raised £100,000 through the Saladin tithe before he died, a 10% tax on all movable goods in England. But even this wasn't enough for Richard, who now embarked upon an almost unseemly sale of lands and titles to the highest bidders. Roger of Howden recorded that he put up for sale all he had: offices, lordships, earldoms, sheriffdoms, castles, towns, lands, everything. It's said that Richard himself even remarked, "I would have sold London if I could have found a buyer." Everything that could be made ready was. And in July 1190, after a final meeting and more oaths of perpetual friendship and profit-sharing with Philip II, Richard set off. His massive fleet from England travelled down the French and Portuguese coasts, from where it would meet him and another fleet at Marseille. Together they sailed first for Sicily. Richard, imbued as he was with a sense of his own mythical destiny, carried a sword rumoured to be Excalibur, King Arthur's legendary blade. And just as Arthur was seen as the saviour of ancient Britons against savage Anglo-Saxons, so Richard was to be the saviour of Jerusalem, Christ's own sword in the battle against infidel Muslims. But early events in Richard's crusading voyage weren't exactly the stuff of messianic legend. Even before the fleet from England had met him at Marseille, it had stopped in Lisbon, Portugal, where it had shown its holy passion by raping women and looting the locals. And Richard himself had later nearly been stoned to death by a bunch of Italian peasants who he had lambasted for flying a hawk. Something only the aristocracy should do, obviously. But the journey had only just begun. The shores of Sicily beckoned next, supposed to be a rest and resupply stop. But it instead welcomed Richard with a tempest. The King of Sicily, William II, as we've heard, had recently died racing off to the Holy Land, and a certain noble named Tancred had immediately seized the throne. But it wasn't his unseemly haste that caused problems. It was that he decided to throw William II's widow, Joan, into the dungeons. Small detail, Joan also happened to be Richard the Lionheart's sister. No sooner had the Lionheart landed in Sicily than he angrily demanded that Joan be released and given her widow's inheritance of gold. Tancred tried to compromise. He let her go, but kept the gold. And when the locals of Messina, where Richard had based himself, revolted in despair at the presence of so many foreign troops, Richard's temper broke. He subjected Messina to a full assault and captured it in short order. As night fell on the 4th of October 1190, Messina crackled with flame as the city burned, set alight by the Lionheart's troops. Above the grey ash of the next morning, the English flag flew above Messina, declaring it conquered in the name of the Angevins. Tancred promptly gave Joan 20,000 ounces of gold to have Messina back, and Richard gone. So, Richard was happy, but the French king Philip II was definitely not. He had travelled to Sicily via Genoa, but was there to witness the sack of Messina. Not only had Richard not consulted him about attacking Messina, a supposedly Christian ally, he had not shared the plunder that came with it. Richard's promises of mutual profit-sharing were already sounding hollow, and it rankled Philip. But if Philip was irritated now, he was soon to go full mushroom cloud. For the last 21 years, Richard had been engaged to Philip's sister, Alice. But Richard had never much fancied the match, probably because there were widespread rumours that Alice had gone to his father, Henry's, bed. But the engagement had never been formally called off, until now. Richard had waited until the Crusade was underway with Philip to let him know that the engagement was finished. Instead, he was to marry an 18-year-old Navarrese princess named Berengaria, who had just arrived in Sicily to be with him. It was beyond awkward. In fact, it was something of a scandal. Richard didn't care much, but Philip really did. It was a humiliation for him and his Capetian dynasty. You could say that Richard was throwing his weight around carelessly, and it came back to bite him later. The Anglo-French allies left Sicily then with much rancour between them, and only the Crusade kept them together, for now. The Holy Land was still calling. In addition to Jerusalem, Saladin had since taken several other cities, key among them being Acre, the vital port city of the Levant. Philip took the French fleet straight there. Richard's fleet, though, got separated by strong winds, causing the second Angevin side quest of the Third Crusade. Around 25 English ships had been storm-swept to Cyprus. This jewel of the eastern Mediterranean was nominally a Byzantine island, but was ruled instead by an independent tyrant, Isaac Comnenus. Those crusaders who had been washed ashore were horribly treated by the Cypriots. Even worse, when Comnenus learned that the ship carrying Richard's sister and new fiancée was one of the 25 to have been swept ashore, Comnenus had troops try to capture it. Richard, not knowing what was occurring in Cyprus, had sailed on to Rhodes in the meantime, where he waited for his wayward ships to catch up with him. Instead, messengers arrived breathlessly, telling him of Comnenus' betrayal of fellow Christians and the attack upon his women. Richard stormed back aboard his ship, red-faced and wide-eyed with fury, bellowing for his captains to make for Cyprus at once. Men rushed to man oars, and sails were unfurled by dozens of hands as moorings were slipped on the fly. The Angevin fleet raced from Rhodes with all the speed it could muster, borne by strong arms, heaven-sent winds, and Richard's wrath. Upon reaching Cyprus, Richard charged through the surf to reach the beach, surrounded by his personal bodyguard of hand-picked knights. Thousands of troops followed, storming the town of Limassol with steel and contempt and vengeance. The Cypriots were shocked by the assault and were quickly beaten back to Famagusta, and when Richard captured Comnenus' daughter, the tyrant surrendered. He asked only that he not be chained in iron, and Richard agreed. He had him chained instead in specially made silver. With the extraordinary conquest of Cyprus, the Lionheart had extended the Angevin Empire to the eastern Mediterranean. But Richard was much less concerned with keeping Cyprus as he was with getting his hands on cold, hard cash. So he sold his newly won island to the Knights Templar for the enormous sum of 100,000 Saracen bezants. It had now been nearly a year since Richard had left Marseille to recapture the Holy Land from rampaging Muslims. Instead, so far he'd fought Christians in Sicily and Cyprus, and those few Italian peasants who had tried to stone him to death for being pompous. But now it was time. From the high peaks of Cyprus, Richard could see the coasts of Syria and Lebanon, and their siren call now drew him to them urgently. As the sun rose above the mountains of the Holy Land, the sails of Richard's fleet filled with a dawn breeze that propelled him to the crusading ambition he had held for 4 years. The decks of his ships bristled with men-at-arms, archers and knights, now restless and impatient to take on the Saracens. It wasn't Jerusalem they sailed for, though, but the famous and crucial port city of the Crusader states, Acre. Saladin had captured it shortly after Jerusalem, along with a swathe of Christian territory. Acre's fall had made reinforcement and resupply much more difficult, so if the crusade was to have any success, Acre had to be retaken at any cost. The city had been besieged for nearly 2 years already. The French under Philip II had arrived 2 months earlier, joining an allied force of Pisans, Genoese, Spaniards, Danes, and a large Holy Roman army under Duke Leopold of Austria. For 2 years Acre had been battered by siege weapons and direct assaults. But still it held, well supplied and garrisoned with loyal and elite Muslim troops. As soon as Philip had arrived, he ordered the construction of a great catapult Malvoisin, or bad neighbour, which traded gigantic rocks with its huge Muslim counterpart, Malquasin, bad cousin. As he approached the city from the sea, Richard would have taken in a scene from hell. To and from the walls, giant stones coursed past each other high in the air, while storms of arrows darkened the sky. The war cries of thousands of warriors storming breaches in the wall mingled with the shrieks of hundreds of them being burned alive by Greek fire hurled at them by the defenders. Bloated corpses bobbed in the sea, bumping against the hulls of Richard's ships as they stared eyelessly upwards, as gulls pecked and tore and feasted. Thousands more from both sides burned in great smoking pyres, the sickly sweet stench of death mingling with the smell of roasted human flesh. Disease had long since riven the Crusader camps, the sickle of death reaving far and wide, and leaving not even Sibylla, Queen of Jerusalem, unharmed. The hot, acrid air, then, was thick with pestilence, and dripped with hate and fear and revulsion. As they landed, Richard and his men surveyed the area. They saw a network of trenches Field Marshal Haig would have been proud of, criss-crossing and ringing the ground in front of Acre. They saw a city which, although battered and smoking, stood obstinately against them. The great stone walls ascending into the sky bore the scars of rocks and fire, and in places breaches had been repaired with rubble and timber. The ground before the walls lay littered with the debris and death of 2 years of war. The closer the ground got to the walls, the more dense it lay with a thicket of dead bodies, riddled with arrows and bolts and the black char of burning. Saladin himself lurked with an army outside Acre, besieging the Crusaders even as they besieged the city. Several times he had launched assaults on the Crusader camp, often coinciding with audacious sallies from the Muslim garrison. Almost always the sallies aimed directly for the great French siege engines, Saracen scimitars whirling and cutting their way through the armed pickets to set fire to the beasts, before racing back inside the city gates, even as Christian knights tried to chase them down. But even as Richard's English host took in the brutality of Acre's siege, they could hardly have been shocked. Many of them were already veterans of the internecine wars between Richard and his father, and the other innumerable squabbles between the lords of Europe. And any who hadn't already been blooded certainly had been by Richard's conquests of Sicily and Cyprus en route to the Holy Land. No, the Englishmen weren't so much shocked as eager, and none more so than Richard himself. He landed at Acre with 8,000 troops, and set to work hiring more, using his enormous wealth to offer greater pay than anyone else to mercenaries who would join him. Many did so from the French ranks, which of course stoked Philip II's continued ire. Richard had only just arrived, and he was already poking at Philip, just as he had in Sicily. But the two worked closely enough to plan what they hoped would be the final assault on Acre. Richard wasn't here to wait. He wanted the glory of capturing the city from Saladin and God's great favour for doing it. So Richard got to work building siege engines to rival those of Philip. He built 2 enormous trebuchets and 2 mangonels. These joined other Crusader trebuchets, Malvoisin of course, and those belonging to the Templars, Hospitallers, the Count of Flanders and the Duke of Burgundy. There was also one named God's Stone Thrower, by which a priest stood day and night praising God, paying people who brought stones for ammunition, and hurling curses at the Muslims as his charge hurled rock. A chronicle from the time, the Itinerarium Regis Ricardi, describes the beginnings of Richard and Philip's assault as a great war of artillery. In total, the Crusaders had 11 powerful trebuchets, and they pummeled Acre. Richard's engines were described as hurling day and night, and one of them killing 12 with a single stone. Another was so swift and violent that its shots reached the inner streets of the city meat market. Nothing, the itinerarian says, could withstand their blows. Everything was crushed or reduced to dust. The Count of Flanders' trebuchets constantly bombarded the tower that guarded a gate the Saracens used frequently until it was half demolished. The Templars' trebuchet wreaked impressive devastation, while the Hospitallers' siege engine also never ceased hurling, to the terror of the Muslims. But the chronicle makes clear that the artillery bombardment was hardly a one-way affair. Quote, "There were plenty of trebuchets in the city, but one of them was unequalled for its massive construction and its effectiveness and efficiency in hurling enormous stones." Unquote. It was talking, of course, about Malquosin. Nothing could stand against the power of this machine. It hurled incredible lumps of rock. Quote, "Violent action, far-hurled stones. The blows smashed everything, whatever they struck. If the stones met no obstruction when they fell, they sank a foot deep into the ground. This machine struck some of our trebuchets and smashed them to pieces, or at least rendered them unusable. Its shots also destroyed many other siege engines, or broke off what it hit. It shot with such force, and its blows were so effective, that no material or substance could withstand the unbearable impact without damage, no matter how solid or well built it was." Unquote. Slowly but surely, though, the itinerarium makes clear the Crusaders began to edge the contest. They continually rebuilt their trebuchets, and God's stone thrower in particular hammered the walls of Acre around the accursed tower, eventually reducing it to mere rubble. Gigantic rocks and stones passing each other high in the air before crashing down with almighty speed and violence, demolishing walls and turning mere people into streaks of blood and dust on both sides. The screams of broken and mangled men joined the chorus of commands shouted from the lords of Christendom as they encouraged their troops to assault the breaches opening up in the city walls. On the 5th of July 1191, as enormous rocks continued to sail over their heads, thousands of Christian knights and men-at-arms surged forward with deafening war cries. Now Saracen archers sent volleys of arrows into the charge, picking off men with sickening thuds, where dark shafts found gaps in armour, plunging deep into necks, groins and eyes. Still the charge came on, over the corpses of crusaders fallen on previous attempts to scale the walls. But those walls were no longer there, now reduced to rubble, to leave giant, smoking, gaping holes, inviting the Christians to glory. But there was little glory in the boiling oil and Greek fire dropped from the edges of those broken walls, turning the front ranks of the charge into a seething mass of writhing, burning agony. The sounds that came from those men weren't screams. They were soul-wrenching shrieks of torture beyond imagining, as their skin either melted or bubbled into death. Even so, the ranks behind continued the charge. These men coursed through a hellscape around the hole in the walls, and met there a ferocious countercharge by the Saracen defenders of the city. The two sides fell into the teeth of a brutal, chaotic maelstrom, a clash of religion and culture reduced to a mass of men tearing at each other's flesh with sword and axe, a frenzy of piercing and cutting and burning and biting and gouging and clawing and disemboweling. Incredibly, Richard the Lionheart was there with them. He had sickened with disease in the days before the assault, but had still demanded to be carried into battle on a litter covered with silk. He took with him a crossbow and fired bolts at it from any Muslim he could see. The Saracens recognised his regal livery, and the air darkened as a hail of arrows soared his way. His bodyguard formed as protective a wall of shields around him as they could, even as he bawled at them to get out of his line of sight. Richard killed several Saracen defenders, and this, together with his personal presence at the front of a vicious and daring operation, gave his men spirit. The French were leading a second assault to the east of the city, and it's a tribute to the skill and bravery of the Muslim garrison that Acre didn't immediately fall under the combined might of the Capetian and Angevin empires. As night fell, neither side had given way, and each cautiously ceased fighting and backed away, leaving the stench of death and burning in the breach. But the Muslims had very little fight left. They sent desperate messages to Saladin, asking him to relieve the siege once and for all. Saladin had tried again and again, and did try one more final, desperate time, but he failed to achieve a breakthrough. On the 12th of July, Acre surrendered. The cost to the Lionheart and his allies in blood and treasure had been immense. But finally the city was theirs. Except to Richard, the word theirs was an overstatement. He viewed the city primarily as an English-won prize, his prize. After all, it had been besieged for nearly 2 years, and only a month after he had arrived, it had fallen. It had been his weight, his money, his men, his iron will that had shifted the balance in the Crusaders' favour. So to Richard, Acre was his, and what he was about to do about that would seal his fate to come. Striding into Acre's royal palace, he had found the livery of Duke Leopold of Austria already decorating the place. His Holy Roman ally had only just had it put up, but now Richard barked orders for it to be unceremoniously torn down, and had his own colours put in its place. It was a gross display of manners and another show of diplomatic naivety from Richard. With this one act, he managed to enrage and alienate himself from almost all the rest of the great lords of Europe. Duke Leopold himself was incensed, and Philip II took it as yet another sign of Richard's arrogance and failure to share the proceeds of the crusade equally, as they had agreed. In fact, Richard had made the crusade one long catalogue of humiliation for Philip. It was the final straw. Jerusalem, the main goal of the Third Crusade, was not yet captured, but Philip and Duke Leopold with him had had enough. They turned around in disgust at Richard and went back to their respective homes, with most of their armies going with them. Although Richard didn't know it yet, this meant Jerusalem would never be recaptured. Richard initially rejoiced at Philip's seemingly infantile storming off, saying that having Philip around was like being a cat with a hammer tied to its tail. But within months he was getting reports that Philip was doing everything he could to undermine Richard's Angevin lands in France. And even worse, his brother John was helping him. Philip hadn't stormed off, he had gone to take revenge. Richard did go on the offensive after Acre. He won a great battle at Arsuf shortly afterwards, and even spectacularly recaptured Jaffa, the last stronghold before Jerusalem itself. But every day and month away from Europe, Philip was chipping away at Richard's power base back at home, and as the news grew increasingly dire, he decided he had to act. He and Saladin, who never met personally but exchanged plenty of letters, had reached a kind of stalemate. Both sides decided peace was worth more than war. The Christians would be allowed to keep what they had won back from Saladin, while the Muslims kept the real prize, Jerusalem. So Richard left the Holy Land with the crusade only a partial success, and it angered and chafed that he had to. But he knew that to continue risked losing his kingdom to Philip and John. He must have been filled with turmoil. But turmoil or not, he also knew he had to focus. To get back home, he would have to go through dangerous territory. Despite his successes, he found he was viewed as an enemy right across Europe. He was the sacker of Messina, the ouster of the ruler of Cyprus who had powerful Byzantine relatives, and the man who had gravely insulted the likes of Duke Leopold and King Philip II. Nearly all the great lords of Europe wanted him captured, and as news of his journey home reached their ears, he, the ruler of the Angevin Empire, found himself extraordinarily hunted by his former allies. The hunt and its aftermath would haunt him until the end of his days. Join me next time as Richard fights for his lands, his titles, and his very freedom. I'm Andrew Mackenzie. Thanks for listening. See you then. You can follow Bite Size Battles on Instagram, and if you can, contribute to our Patreon through the link in our bio.